To lead us off this morning, I'd like to welcome to the podium Sam Walkom. Some of you may know Sam from his former days where he did kick around here in South Australia. I know he spent some time with Sam Jolly at Productive Nutrition. He may have spent some time elsewhere, I'm not sure, but Sam's a graduate, PhD graduate from the University of Adelaide, so a local for those of you are close to home here, where his focus of that PhD was on breeding for robustness in maternal sheep. Sam's completed his PhD and is currently a postdoctoral candidate at AGBU, the Animal Genetics and Breeding Unit in Armidale, and the focus of his role at AGBU is on the genetic relationships between adult ewe weight, body condition and reproduction, and the potential to improve ewe productivity within variable environments. So from that background of his PhD and current postdoctoral work, Sam's going to join us to kick off the session looking at the impact of breeding for robustness and its influence on reproduction. Thank you, Sam.
Thanks, Richard. Before I start, the notes you've got in your book are an extended version of this presentation. I've cut it down to some key points just to make sure we fit in time. So there'll be some information in there that adds to this presentation. If you've got questions about that, my email's at the end of the presentation so we can discuss if we don't get an opportunity to do it today. So the work I'm presenting today is a sort of a case study in this area of robustness, some work I've been doing with Daniel Brown and following on from a PhD. So it's sort of an area of interest for myself. So this idea of a robust ewe, from a theoretical point of view, there's a lot of ways in which we can describe robustness, whether it's to regards to the ability of the animal to continue to produce across a variety of environments, or its ability to resist diseases or continue to produce whilst it's got a pathogen or a parasite burden on it. But I suppose from a sheep producer's point of view, really it is all about is, can we have a ewe that's going to phenotypically express its genetic superiority across a range of environments? So you could put it down even further just to, we want a ewe that will produce a lamb every year, no matter what the environment it faces that year. So if you have a year where you have lower rainfall, you still want it to produce that lamb each year. And how can we select for an animal that could do that? And that's sort of where we've gone into it. So when we talk about it, there were some potential traits in which we saw could be used to describe what would be a robust ewe. So the top three, which is sort of where I've focused most of my work, is body condition score, this idea of selecting on changes in weight or condition across the production cycle, and then of course repro. But there's also others such as worm egg count, fly strike, and breech wrinkle as a predictor of fly strike. So in this presentation, I'll focus primarily on these three traits up the top, but you'll see in the paper that you've got, or the printout that you've got, that the area of work with the worm egg count, fly strike, and breech wrinkle is covered. So that's there for further reference. So body condition score is probably one of those traits that people talk about quite a lot when they think of robustness. As Daniel was saying yesterday, as a genetic trait, it's highly correlated with adult weight. It's also highly correlated with other adult body condition scores. So genetically, if it's got a high body condition score at the start of the production cycle, so joining, genetically she'll also have a high body condition score at weaning. Okay, hope that explains a little bit, and it'll also hold up through her life. So those genetically high for condition in their first lambing will also be genetically high for body condition score at a later age. So if you're going to select on body condition, you're going to see those advantages throughout that ewe's life. Regards to heritability, it's reasonably good heritability, so we can make selection on it, even though it's considered a subjective measurement from the producer. I'd like to highlight a few genetic correlations which are quite beneficial, and we'll see later their impact on the current merino indexes. So in regards to, these are just, across here are the standard traits, so you've got yearling weight, mature weight, post-weaning fat, muscle, fleece weight, foal diameter, Curvature, staple strength, this is worm egg count here. Number of lambs weaned is our repro trait in this count. Then we've got condition score, fly strike, breech wrinkle, and weight change. So most of these correlations will come from the current sheep genetics, but the new traits which I've brought in are from work we've pulled from the INF. But the points to be made is we've got that nice strong correlation with weight, as well as fat and eye muscle depth. So if you're going to make selections on post-weaning fat or muscle, you're going to see responses in the U condition. So if we keep pushing for a leaner animal, we are going to lead to a leaner U. But you could look at the other way. If you need to put more fat onto your U, you can do it at a young age through selection. So reasonably good here. We have a negative relationship with fleece weight. It's not that strong, and a detrimental one with fibre diameter, so the micron will increase if we continue to push U condition through selection. So weight change is another trait that's been put forth. I've done some work on it. I don't think it's such a great trait as we'd hoped. In regards to heritability, it's very low. Very hard to select on the change trait. How do you define the periods of change? What happens during that period of change will be a big problem. And its hope was that it would be related to repro, but the problem is with that relationship is that repro is a large effect on weight change in the U. And so if you don't account for that effect of having that lamb, then your weight change trait's going to be heavily inaccurate. But we've put it in there. It's a lowly heritable trait. The thinking is that if we can avoid weight change, we're producing a more robust ewe because you can get through the harsher times supposedly a little bit better. But again, we see an unfortunate relationship with both fleece weight and fibre diameter for weight change. And I think when we think of robustness, we may not think of repro as that trait. And I'll come back to this later, that maybe trying to find other traits to describe really what we want to, what our issue is probably not the right way, and that repro is the trait of interest when we talk about robustness, because we want the ewe to produce a lamb each year. So maybe that's the trait we need to look at. Number of lambs weaned in tough environments or something like that. So I think a lot of people are aware of what this trait does, where it sits, but I just suppose put this forth because it is a trait that we can use to describe robustness, even though it may not be that one we'd necessarily have thought of in the first place. So what we've done here, and I'll describe a bit further, is we've now going to look at the merino indexes, and we're going to look at the effect they are having on robustness and the potential advantages of including some of these traits. So currently, sheep genetics, or the indexes that you get, do not describe an individual's ability to respond to the environmental stresses. We don't have a measure of that. What you're doing is breeding for an animal with a high generic merit across a variety of environments in which they're measured. So again, this comes back to the fact that we need to get records in these tough times, or understand these tough times, and I'll get back to that. And what sheep genetics does is fits by side by flock to account for some of that G by E and sort of adjusts for it, and so you'll get a flat trait. So I'm now going to show you a series of graphs, and I'll spend a bit of time on this one because it's the first of three and they're all the same, so we'll describe it a bit better. On the x-axis, we've got those same traits that we're talking about with the correlations, so yearling weight, mature weight, fat, muscle depth, fleece weight, all the way through. So this is primarily your production traits, and then in this second graph we've got the resilience or robustness traits we're talking about. Now, on the y-axis we've got a scaled trait gain over 10 years. So if it's going up, we're seeing an increase in that trait. If it's going down, we see a decrease. The numbers aren't so much the important thing here, but to look at where they're heading, and then as we move through, we'll see how they're changing when we do different things within the index. So then we've got the three merino indexes, the fibre, so high emphasis on fibre diameter, merino, fleece weight, and then we've got the dual purpose merino. We didn't repeat it in the terminals or maternal indexes, but I think some of the points that we make in this will be able to relate through quite well. So if we look at what the indexes are doing now, in regards to these robustness traits, it sounds all good for WEC. We're improving WEC, except for in the merino production, but it's not much of a problem. So we're going in the right way. We're seeing improvements in number of lambs weaned from using the current indexes. We're also seeing improvements in condition score of our ewe. If we use the current indexes, in theory, our ewe condition score will improve. We don't see much change in fly strike. This is probably the big problem with breech wrinkle, and that's just because of some antagonistic relationships. We're moving towards a wrinklier sheep if we keep breeding for more fleece weight or fibre diameter unchecked. And then, as we can see, we're reducing the variation in weight change from the indexes. So this is quite a good thing. We've looked at some traits. They are describers of robustness, potentially, and the current indexes are moving them in the right direction. So that's good. If we then look at what's the impact of improving the records for these robustness traits, so if as seed stock providers you go out and record these traits and we put them in so we have a greater more phenotypic information on the ewes, and we can use their relationships with other traits, and of course there'll be some indirect selection to remove the really bad ones, but we're not putting them in the index at this stage. And so by improving the traits, now as you can see the slides changed a little bit. This black hollow bar is what we were looking at before. So the change is how much white is in that bar compared to before, and that's how much the traits are changing. So if we start measuring these traits, we do see some little problems. We see a reduction in yearling weight or growth in the merinos, and we see this drop in stable strength, but they're not too bad realistically. But the good thing is that we do see even more improvement in repro, and that's the one we're trying to focus on, if that's what we're saying is the issue. And we are including measurements on condition score and other traits like that. We're seeing an improvement in reproduction. We're also seeing much better improvements in WEC when we bring that in measurements, and we gain with the condition score. So that comes back to, if this is a trait of importance to you, you need to measure it and start recording it. And once you do that, you're going to see a lot of improvement. So I think that's the point to take from this, and we can avoid that wrinklier skin by bringing breech wrinkle into the index, which is all quite nice. So what we've now done now is we put an economic value on these traits based on requirements to put on the extra condition score and feed costs and that sort of thing, and then we've put them back into the index. So we now don't see that problem with yearling weight, and that's primarily because that strong relationship between condition score and weight. If we put a value on a condition score, we put more emphasis on it, and that will help bring up yearling weight. We still see that reduction in staple strength, but it's sort of not quite as bad as it was before. But again, the pleasing thing is that if we use the current indexes, we are going to see improvement in these robustness traits. And then if you add them or measure them and even put some economic value on them, we're going to see an even stronger response to them. And as I've highlighted with number of lambs weaned, we really see that nice improvement in ewe productivity in regards to these traits. So I think it's quite a nice story that current indexes aren't going to, by the looks of it in merinos, destroy ewe robustness. But if we also think that these traits are of strong value to your system, by including them we can make improvements in the traits of interest without heavily costing our production traits. So I think it's quite positive. In regards to economic impact, what we sort of saw in those graphs before is that in the fibre production index, where we have a high emphasis on fleece production, we don't see as much value in the robustness traits. And that's primarily because of the strong correlations between condition score with muscle, reproduction and weight, which become more prominent and more valuable in the merino production and dual purpose indexes, and that's why we see a slightly higher improvement in economic gains through that way, because we've got a trait that's more directly related to or closely related to the traits of interest. So that's again a nice thing to see, that we're going to get some nice improvements, and it's going to vary across production systems. So maternal guys might see even more value because of that strong relationship with number of lambs weaned. So that's a nice story, and we've got this nice relationship with robustness traits that we can look at. And I suppose I've left a bit of time for questions because this might, the next point might bring it through a few more. With my work, we did a lot of work on body condition score and tough times and environment, and we always fall down because we can't statistically or scientifically describe the environments faced within commercial systems very well. And there's been a bit of an underlying story that we should select for fat, and that fat will improve reproduction in tough times. And, well, not in the bad time. Like in the good times it doesn't matter, it's just extra fat. So I want to challenge that a little bit, and I think if people think about it a bit more, we might see some value in it. But what we've done here is we've regressed the daughter's reproductive performance against her size ASBVs for a couple of traits. And if we do that against the size ASBV for number of lambs weaned, if we improve that by 1%, we'll see an increase in number of lambs born per ewe by 0.66, okay? So that's a nice response. You know, we're getting what we want. We select on the size ASBV for NLW, and we get a response in number of lambs born per ewe. Expected, and it's quite nice. But the point to make is that then there's the adage, I will select for more fat. But if we select for more fat, which is the same relationship, so we're just looking for what happens if we increase the size ASBV by 1 millimetre for P fat or yearling fat, and its response in fertility or number of lambs born. So when we did this in the information nucleus FOC, no effect on average. So there's no relationship at all. So by selecting for fat, on an average year, you're not going to get any improvements in repro. In the maternal ewes, same thing. In the merino select, we saw a slight improvement in fertility and number of lambs born, but it's definitely not anywhere near the sort of gains you can make from selecting for repro. And so that the adage would be, it's an extra little bit of fat, it'll help we'll do both. But I want to put this, there's a warning to that. Other work said that you see this gain in the tough environments, and in the good environments it's nothing, so it's all good. What we found was that the impact of fat was highly variable, and it was both detrimental and favourable. So just as a year could be, you get an extra 10 lambs or whatever from per mil, which I think's been reported, you could lose 10 lambs per mil of fat. So the question then comes in, why are we using a different trait to select to improve robustness when we have a trait in number of lambs weaned which we can select for? And I get the adage that if we select for number of lambs weaned, we'll just produce really highly fertile ewes, and when the time gets tough, they'll fall over. Well, why don't we select for ewes that produce lambs in tough environments? And that's the ewe that we want to look for. So that's my little argument to the story. And as I'll say later, it might change a bit in the future. So to summarise, the current approach produces animals with a high genetic merit for the traits in which they're evaluated. The current practices will influence the robustness of the national sheep flock, and by the sounds of it, within merinos at least, it's all going in a safe way. So we're not destroying your robustness by using the current indexes. And if we decide that the robustness traits are more important to your system and we want to bring them in, by selecting on them, we're not going to destroy the gains we can make in the production traits or detrimentally select against where we want to go. And finally, measure the traits of important to your system and in the environments faced. So, whilst I've made some claims, and I suppose as much they're here for discussion and I'm willing to throw them around, the big limitation that I've found with my work is being able to capture extreme commercial environments and getting strong information on what the environment's faced. So, if we look at industry data like sheep genetics, just pull the data straight from there, we have no idea of what sort of environments you faced each year. We can get a rainfall from the local bomb site, but sometimes that's not next to your farm and they might be slightly different. and we don't know how much feed you've given them, and so we can't say that's a tough year when fat was more valuable, or that was a good year when it was having a bad effect. And so from a research point of view, having an idea of that the environment being faced and the feed availability is probably the biggest limitation to any arguments being made at the moment about robustness traits. And that also brings forth maybe the value of placing specific dollar values on traits of interest in different environments, but we'll see. And I'll highlight again, I think there's value in measuring these traits. If it's of interest to you and you think it's important, measure it, and then we've got something to work with from there. So again, I'll finish off. If a trait is of value, so if you think robustness is of value to your system, measure the traits you think that describe robustness. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Some food for thought there, I'm sure, and some challenges to some current thinking. A couple of hands up already. I guess it's an interesting point Sam makes, I think, about the environment in which we select animals. And if you'll let me just cast my memory back a number of years now when I worked in central Queensland in the beef industry. Within seed stock industries there are characters, and I'm sure you all know some characters amongst your breed or amongst the sheep industry. Well, one of the characters I met in central Queensland is a bloke called Alf Collins, who people either think Alf Collins is brilliant or they think he's got a couple of roos loose in the top paddock, and I say that with due respect to Alf, he's a very bright fellow. But one of his mantras which made him stand out in the Brahman industry in the north was his adage that he ran his cattle, and the way he ran his seed stock herd was under the mantra, "I'll put the acid on them." And he ran his herd as tough and probably tougher than most commercial operations that I experienced in my years in North Queensland, and was very much related to what Sam was talking about of making sure that he found animals that would do wherever they went. Okay, who was the first hand? We had Alan. We might start with Alan and then Forbes. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Alan Piggott here. Look, that was a great presentation, and I think it reinforces in my mind the importance of condition scoring our sheep and making sure we find the sheep that can produce their weight in lamb and still get back to a reasonable condition score pre-mating next year. I have got a lot of that information at home and I haven't put in the system. I'm just not too sure how to manage the environmental influences on the condition scores as they come through. There's a fair variation of when they lambed, so some would have just weaned lambs, some would have weaned lambs a few months earlier, whether they had a single or a twin, whether they carried those lambs through or whether they died before they got to weaning. Will the system take all that into account, or do I have to identify those management groups myself?
I'm not quite sure how we'll end up working with it, but the chats with Daniel was that pre-joining condition score is probably the best one to use. It's when the ewe is dry, so she's not going to have the current lambing problems affect on her. She's also had time to recover from the previous cycle. And if we think about it really simply, if the ewe can't recover after the period from weaning to joining, and you want to actually disadvantage her. If she's down the bottom, then that's good. You can maybe cull her for poor condition because she didn't recover. And so I think if we use pre-joining condition at this time is probably the best way to do it. Then there's less information needed to come in. If we start moving down the production cycle towards weaning condition score or pre-lambing or stuff like that, then there is large effects from number of lambs weaned, period of the gestation cycle, effect of lactation, all those sort of things that will start to impact the phenotype, and so you'll see a re-ranking that's not necessarily genetic. So I think if we move towards using a pre-joining condition score at this stage, then that's going to make big moves, and then we can work from there.
Forbes, Brian, great talk, Sam. One little point, I'm just wondering whether you set a test for us this morning to see whether we're awake. There's a slide there that I am sort of puzzling over, and it was to do with indirect selection for reproduction, the first one. You had something like 0.66 lambs born. It's got to be per 100 ewes, surely, because I think it's different on your slides in the presentation.
Yeah, the presentation is been adjusted. So in the booklet, it's per 100 ewes, and on the presentation, it's per ewe. So
okay. Am I awake?
Yeah, you're awake.
Good.
G'day Sam, yeah, good talk. Wayne Pitchford here from University of Adelaide. I think the value of condition is not at joining time because, as you've pointed out quite rightly, that we should just select for number of lambs weaned, and that will indicate impacts on reproduction. The real issue is sort of now and the next couple of months and trying to get our pregnant ewes through tough times. And so to me, on farm, the real trait of economic value is body condition, probably pre-lambing. And I know the problem is if they're carrying twin lambs versus single lambs, but really that's the trait that people are looking for, is those that are going to be able to carry better condition during that autumn period and set themselves up for, you know, all the things that lifetime ewe management tells us we should have.
Yep, I think we've had this conversation before, surprisingly. I think I do agree. From a genetic point of view, if we want to select on condition score, pre-joining is probably the easiest one to make that genetic selection. From a management point of view, I can't be more positive about using condition score across the production cycle as a management tool, especially with the twins and managing them that way. So there probably is scope to bring that information about lambing along with the body condition score in regards to using that. But I think from a point of view where we don't have any condition score at this time, bringing in the joining ones is probably the easiest and quickest way to bring it into the system and then move through the cycle and account for lambing.
Yeah, Sam, lucky day here. I'm a bit confused, but yeah, I'm just here. You're looking for me? Yeah.
Yep.
I'm a bit confused, but you don't have to feel that like everyone can confuse me, so it's no great achievement. But a couple of things. One, you talked about you're not sure about the relevance of fat in assisting number of lambs weaned, and then I feel you've contradicted yourself by you're saying you haven't tested it in a real commercial environment where there's tough conditions. So that sort of confuses me a bit. You've come to these conclusions without having sort of road tested it in really harsh environments. And going back to your correlations, said condition score, I think it's got a 0.8 correlation with fat, and it's also got a positive correlation with number of lambs weaned. So there's two things there. Going that way, you've said that condition score and fat's got a positive correlation with number of lambs weaned, and then later on you've said that it doesn't have an effect in other research you've done. And also, if there's a 0.8 correlation with a measured trait, an objective trait, why not use that objective trait of post-weaning fat or yielding fat rather than using a subjective trait like condition score?
All right, so I'll try and do that in a couple of sections. As I've highlighted, we don't have a measure of those tougher commercial systems, and so I suppose I'm trying to put a bit of a warning signal on there. From our work with the fat, it can be as detrimental, and so if you go out to all your producers and say, fat, you might go down the wrong lane and fall down. And that's, I suppose, where the research needs to be taken further, is to get that tough versus good environments with a clear indication of what that tough environment is, so that we know whether fat can do it. Because we want to go towards lean meat yield and all those sort of traits as well, we probably need to do this. So I suppose there is an advantage in selecting for fat for repro, but all I'm saying is that there's also potentially a detrimental effect that we need to be aware of and be warned about. And so why not select for repro, and if they become fat as a result of selecting for that, well then they become fatter. But that's the real trait that we're interested, which is repro in the tough environment. So let's select on that, and if by a product those ewes end up being fatter, well, that's great, but we've moved them on the trait we want, not on another trait where we might see some problems. And that again highlights, I think, answers the question on the board, that at this stage we don't have any data available where we have a clear indication of how tough that environment was, or under nutritional restrictions, or how the ewes went, because we just don't have that environmental data, which is probably restricting some of the claims we can make. But in this work, when you can manage ewe reserves through feed or something like that, there's not much value in fat, so to speak. I think that answers the question, or maybe.
The other part was subjective, like condition score, as
Yeah.
as highly correlated with
Yeah, so it is highly correlated with young weight. So that's a good thing. If we're going to go down the line of we want to improve the condition score of our ewe, we can make selections at a young age quite accurately with post-weaning fat or muscle. Muscle's just as important as fat in regards to condition score. So selecting on one or either or both will improve condition score in the ewe. So you can do that, and that's quite a sensible decision to be making.
Yeah, Sam, the last two questions have kind of covered whatever, but one of your answers there, it is balance, and you nearly just answered my question just then about muscle and things, but I got quite alarmed when you went, there's this huge thing out there in industry going fat, 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 fat. It's in balance with growth and in muscle, and unless I've missed something along the journey, we haven't got a condition score breeding value that we can rely on coming through sheep genetics. We've got a 0.8 correlation with fat. We keep saying condition score. Maybe it's just the way the language we're using around fat. If it's a good indicator of condition score, which is the only one we've got, and your alternate number of lambs weaned, I couldn't agree more. But if the data in there was good, and honestly, I think you'd count on one hand the number of people in Merino Select that were giving full pedigree, full dead dries, fictitious lambs, dead at births, to give that figure actually some sort of merit. So it's a balanced thing. It's a great guide, and it represents condition score. And if it's used in balance, I'm a little concerned about your message that fat could be dangerous, because it's probably the most overlooked important trait that we've got, and we need to put focus on in merino. So
yeah, it's a good point. I suppose the point I'm trying to make, and it's good to see discussion here about this area, is that we've got a trait in number of lambs weaned, and if the worst thing that comes out of this presentation is that more people record number of lambs weaned properly, then, well, I'd be pretty happy. But I think that's the point, is that we need to tell people that that's the trait of interest, not fat. And fat may be a byproduct that helps reproduction in the long way, but we've really got to focus on number of lambs weaned to move the trait that we want, and that's where we need to put our focus. I think if fat is controlled, we move it slowly, we don't put too much emphasis on that being the answer or the silver bullet, then I think there's merit in it. So I suppose that's what I've tried to challenge you with a bit today.
Martin Oppenheimer. Sam, I'm getting quite confused now. And I can understand why Hamish put you first up for the morning session. I'm really confused now as to whether most of your talk relates to merinos or terminals or maternals, because obviously, in the different categories of sheep, different breeds of sheep, there's going to be different requirements. And I mean, in merino, I'd back up what Andrew Buffler just said. In the merinos, there's a real case for more fat, and where we see some leading industry sires that are very high production animals for fleece weight, and of course then they're very low, very lean, very low for fat. And if they are potentially doing a lot of damage out in the industry if they're breeding those overly lean sheep. So, but in the terminals it might be completely different, and we might be looking at fat for different reasons. So. And on that, I'm sort of interested. I think I've asked the question to the sheep genetics people. Why number of lambs weaned doesn't sort of rate very well on Lamb Plan as it does on Merino Select, but that's another issue. But I'm just confused where most of your work is. I think you mentioned maternals, but merinos. In some cases, we definitely need more fat.
Yeah, so the index work was done in merinos, and we did see that there was a significant effect of fat on repro. So more fat, you're going to improve reproduction in the merino ewe. We didn't see it in the INF or maternals, so that's probably highlights the impact of that crossbreeding. So I think with merinos, there's definitely, you don't want to go leaner. You definitely want to avoid that, and it's probably more important to you than, say, a maternal or a terminal breeder. But I suppose what I've trying to describe, and maybe it's got confused a little bit now that we've asked a lot of questions, is that repro is your key trait. You might see some advantages from improving fat, but focus on repro as the trait of interest and try and push that a bit more through better trait recording or pedigrees and getting that out there in the industry, that's where you're going to see your big improvements, and that if fat comes along for the ride, well, that's great. But you would want to avoid going any leaner with the merinos, definitely.
But the number of lambs weaned issue has quite a number of issues involved. One is the ease of getting all your information in through sheep genetics is not easy. They don't use mating modules and so on to determine dries and those sorts of things because they don't like making assumptions. But one of the things that I think you've overlooked is that with number of lambs weaned, particularly with sires, the ram's 5 or 6, 7 years old before you know how good he is for number of lambs weaned. And hence you're making some assumptions on the daughters and so on at an early stage on number of lambs weaned with a low accuracy.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how to respond in regards to the sheep genetics and how that can be improved or worked further, but I think there is definitely merit in spending some time on improving how those traits are measured and getting information on them. Hamish might want to add to that a little bit more. Or
I think that should tie in pretty well with Will's talk in just over half an hour's time about recording repro details. So I think that should fit in pretty well with the program. In terms of the accuracy of those breeding values, yes, it is a low heritability trait, so there's going to be a lot of noise caused by environmental factors, but at the end of the day, I think there are real runs on the board in terms of people who have been using number of lambs weaned breeding values and have made significant improvements in flock fertility and marking percentages. So, yes, we would like to do a much better job of recording the data that we need to analyse those traits. That is on its way now, and there's continual improvements to how we're calculating those breeding values.
Thanks, Hamish. I'm going to have to bring that to a close now. We've used up Sam's time well and truly, and I note there were a couple of points came through from the live feed. We'll store those questions and bring them back into the panel session before we wind up at lunchtime. So could you put your hands together and thank Sam for that presentation? Clearly a presentation and a topic that's sparked a lot of thought by the questions and the vigorous nature of those questions. So yes, I think you might be right, Martin. Hamish picked a good topic to start the day. I hope everybody's wide awake now and ready to